Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you everyone for attending our second installment of Morning Byte of Cyber. As some quick background, we're the Colorado Cyber Resource Center. We're a program of the National Cybersecurity Center. We're nonprofit based here in Colorado with the focus of driving more cyber awareness and education. The Colorado Cyber Resource Center is the joint product of local CISOs and IT professionals working with the NCC through the Whole of State Working Group to create a one-stop shop for local governments in Colorado for cyber resources and support. You can learn more at our website at colorado-crc.com. We'll put that in the chat. All right, so today we are excited to talk about insurance. Said no one ever.
That's not the usual reaction we get. Thank you.
I know, but we really are excited to talk about it because this is something that's on a lot of people's minds. Whether you've got a policy a few years ago and just not sure what to be thinking about how to use it effectively now in some of your incident response planning, whether you've been trying to get it and have been denied coverage, or whether you just want to know if it's right for your organization, is a tough topic. But we are glad to have an expert here today to walk us through what's happening in the industry and ultimately how to think about through cyber insurance as a local government. So some quick housekeeping real quick. We are recording this and it will be shared to our YouTube channel. And additionally, if you have questions during the discussion, feel free to add them into the chat and we'll address them at the end. With that, I am excited and grateful to introduce Tom Swartz. Tom leads Marsh's Oklahoma operations, and works with a variety of clients from public entities to global chemical companies, including advising on all lines of coverage. He's worked with numerous clients navigating a complex and very volatile cyber market. Tom's been with Marsh for over 20 years, and after spending 10 years practicing as a consulting engineer working in over 22 countries. Tom, that's a lot. Thank you so much for being here. Your expertise is going to be so invaluable to us. And again, we're just excited that you're here and appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to the group. And goodness, we'll jump right in. I would encourage any questions through the chat. I'm happy to jump in with any questions as they come up. Or we can spend a few minutes at the end answering questions either way. I appreciate the introduction and I appreciate the comment about we're excited to talk about insurance. That's a phrase not often uttered. It is it's a very volatile market right now. So I'm going to start off talking a little bit about what cyber policies cover. And then we'll talk about the market itself and what's going on, what we're seeing from the insurers. And then talk a little bit about the process and the things that the insurers are looking for from a control and risk management perspective. So we'll go to the next slide.
Yes.
Great, thanks. So really, there's two sort of categories of broad coverage if you think about it from a cyber perspective. First being the first party coverages, right? So when we talk about first party coverages in the insurance business, we're really talking about coverage for losses that are incurred by you during an event. So in the cyber side of things, you think about that from a standpoint of business income and extra expense, right? So for instance, you have a interruption in service, either through ransomware, somebody bricks your services or something like that, and you have a loss of business income, profit, operating costs, et cetera. And so the cyber policies actually do respond to that first party loss. Data and asset protection, right? You may have employees, you may have first party data that gets corrupted or gets lost. It pays for restoration of that corrupted data, vendor costs to recreate it, et cetera. It also provides you event management and breach response. So in essence, what happens in these situations oftentimes is you have a substantial amount of forensic costs associated with these losses where you have to go back and rebuild, or you have to go back and find out, hey, when did the loss occur? Where's our backup in accordance with that, et cetera. And none of this stuff comes cheap, right? It also provides public relations response, managing call center, et cetera, depending on the size of the breach and whatnot. So, and then finally, cyber extortion. which really think that more commonly we phrase that now, basically ransomware, right? So they get into your system, they lock it down, demand a ransom for unlocking it and providing you the keys. It's interesting because what I hear from the or from the IT crowd is that nowadays they even have it down to who are the good actors within the bad actors, right? So you got ransomware, they actually know folks who, or they know the bad actors well enough now that they even recognize, hey, this is somebody that actually will unlock your system if you pay the ransom, versus somebody who just vaporizes and leaves you hanging anyway. So, who knew, right? That's honor amongst thieves, apparently. But so ransomware and cyber extortion has really taken off in the last couple of years, and it's really been driving the market. We'll talk about that in a minute. So if you can go to the next slide. So the other component of it is third-party liability coverage, right? So that's losses to people that you have a responsibility for through a network loss, right? So privacy liability, right? You've got, and this was really kind of one of the primary drivers for coverage early on in the industry, was all about PII and how much data you held from third parties and what happens if that gets out, and you have to provide them with credit monitoring and all of that kind of stuff. And you can get into lawsuits around the privacy breach, et cetera. So that was a real driver early on in the industry, was the third party coverages. Network security liability, if you're managing data or a network for somebody else. It's got regulatory and defense costs in there, right? Even civil fines and penalties associated with loss of data is covered under the policies. And then, of course, media liability, like what happens if you've damaged somebody else's reputation, those kinds of things associated with a cyber loss are also covered under these policies. So, I mean, the beauty of the cyber policies is they are actually very broad. They're very broad coverage. A lot of different triggers available, and a lot of very broad coverage in the event of a loss. So if we can go to the next slide. So really, as I alluded to earlier, and we'll talk about this quite a bit more, but it is a very, very volatile insurance market right now. It's getting more and more difficult to actually get coverage. But what we're seeing is that the insurers are starting to look for some very key things that you have in place as loss control in order that they'll write you as a insured. So we've kind of boiled those down to kind of 12 key factors, and there's actually a lot more data about this in the appendices. If you like some good nighttime reading. But I'll say this, one of the critical things that we see is MFA, right? Multi-factor authentication. If you don't have multi-factor authentication, then there's a good chance you won't get coverage, period, right? And so there's varying degrees of that, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes about communicating with the carriers of these things. But that is a very critical thing that everybody's looking for. Endpoint detection and response, tested backups, that's become a big issue, right, with the ransomware side of things. The carriers want to understand what your backups are, how they're separated from your system, how frequently they're done. If in the event of a lockdown, can you go back up, and how frequent is that, et cetera. Privileged access management. So really that's a key area for them as well. So they want to know anybody that has got administrative rights or privileged access, how are you managing that? How are you limiting it? Do they have, do you have extra layers of security around those types of individuals who are accessing your system? And then, email filtering and web security. I mean, that's the rest of these are a little more basic, but the ones in orange are sort of almost go, no-go decisions for the carriers, right? If you're stumbling around on those critical factors, you may have trouble getting coverage. And probably a lot of the folks on the call are a lot more, have a lot more expertise in the remainder of these than I do, but this gives you it gives you good guidance as to what the carriers are looking for in this volatile market. So if you go to the next slide. So again, this is kind of just remunerating the same thing. Again, sort of those top 3 or 4 are really, really very, very important when it comes to talking to your insurers and trying to get coverage. Let's go to the next one. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the application process, right? Particularly with this market and how it's going, the application process is very important. And it is, we're in a very strange time right now in that the losses and the change in the insurance market has occurred so rapidly that the applications that were all developed 2 or 3 years ago are not necessarily addressing adequately the things the carriers are really looking for, right? And so it's important to try to communicate through that application process as much as possible about what it is that you have. So a lot of the questions end up being sort of look like they're yes, no questions, right? And I'll just say in general, none of these questions are yes, no questions, right? So often this is a complex area, and I'm while I'm an insurance expert, I'm not a cyber expert, but the questions are very basic, but the answers can be very complicated. So even things like MFA, it's like, okay, do you have 100% MFA? You answer the question no, because maybe you're not using MFA when you're actually in the office or something like that. And maybe there's a perfectly good reason for that, and there's some explanations that go with it, right? So that's important to communicate to the carrier. And that gets done through application process as sort of a first pass. So the more you can elaborate on things, the better off you are. Oh, my light just went off, but it probably works fine. So it's very important to communicate what you can about your risk management philosophy around cyber. Even if it's a no answer, provide elaboration. And you can do that through an appendices. You can do it through additional commentary. However you do it in the application is fine. We will also typically, once we have the information in the applications and get that out to the marketplace, we will also generally be having conversations with the underwriter and with IT folks, risk management, but really oftentimes the security officer for the entity will be on the phone with the underwriters, and then the underwriters have a very deep understanding, and they have technical folks as well. So then it becomes a very technical conversation about what the loss control is. So if you go to the next one, the other thing that has come up is this ransomware supplemental application. So that has become another critical factor, right? Because, and we'll talk about it in a minute, because so many of the losses in this space are being driven by ransomware, right? So at the early stages of the market, broad coverage, data losses were all the rage, right? The targets of the world and all of that kind of stuff. And now it's really ransomware. So the carriers have all come out with ransomware supplemental applications. And the responses to that are very important as well. So, and then kind of behind there is something that says Cyber Edge supplemental questionnaire and ransomware. We do have actually an application process that is independent of the carriers as a broker, so that we can sometimes not use the applications the carriers have because we're trying to go out to multiple markets. So us or whoever your broker is may have a similar system where you can actually go in and answer questions. Also, we team with cyber, I think it's called Cylance, that can actually go in and do sort of white hat pings on your system and evaluate whether there's weaknesses. And I know a few of the carriers do that as well. I say a few, probably most of them do. some of them being more active in it than others. So it's a very complicated process compared to what it used to be a few years ago. So if you'll click to the next one. So I've mentioned it a few times, the volatility of the market, et cetera. So what's driving that, right? What's happened? Why is it so crazy out there? First of all, the claims, right? The claims have really, really accelerated in the last just 2 years. And you've seen it on the news. I mean, the Colonial Pipeline thing, all of those kinds of things. And ransomware has become the real risk. And the claims in ransomware have gone exponentially higher. I mean, it used to be that, okay, you got somebody locked your system up and they asked for $10,000 of Bitcoin and you gave it to them and they unlocked the system and everybody went down the road. And now it's multi-millions of dollars. Some of the demands are. So that has accelerated dramatically. So we're seeing the claims go up. As a response, right, the carriers are in the business of making money. And so if their losses exceed their underwriting premium, then they have a problem. And really the only thing they can do is limit the losses via tighter underwriting or denying coverage to people or increasing their rates or some combination of both. So rates have accelerated dramatically, and I'll show you some statistics in a moment about that. But it's gotten again the rates have gotten exponentially higher than they have been in the past. Capacity and attachments going down. So what that means was, so for us in the insurance business, what happens is most of the carriers don't just write cyber; they write a lot of different things. Right. So I showed you the Beasley application. Well, Beasley writes all kinds of casualty cover and pollution coverage and some property coverage, et cetera. So what happens in the insurance industry is as losses accelerate in a particular line of coverage, the carriers at the global level may have issues and they may decide to put their capital into lines of business that are more predictable and more profitable, right? So what we see then is that carriers begin to restrict their capacity or just leave the market altogether. And so, of course, that obviously drives the competition, supply and demand, right? As the supply goes down of the capacity, they have more power to increase their rates. And we are seeing that now. The other thing that they do in trying to control the losses is they'll raise the retention, if you will. So before they will provide you any coverage, you have to spend so much money on the issue before the insurance kicks in. Obviously, they can control the losses by raising that SIR. So we see that as well, right? Not uncommon to have very low $50,000, $25,000 retentions on programs that are now seeing $500,000 and $1 million retentions. The other thing that we're seeing is that, particularly on ransomware, carriers will limit their total capacity out to a particular risk on the ransomware by creating a co-insurance clause. So they'll basically say, well, we'll give you a $5 million policy, but for excess of the SIR for the $5 million, if it's a ransomware issue, we'll only pay 50% of that. So you're essentially self-insuring the other 50%. So you can be on the hook for 2.5 of the 5. Underwriting, I mentioned this a minute ago, but the other thing is, okay, speaking as the carrier, how do we limit our risk? How do we limit our losses? Either we just don't write it or we write it with a lot more underwriting scrutiny. And that's really why I wanted to highlight the thing about the applications, because that has a major impact on whether or not you can get the coverage, because they are making themselves much smarter about how they underwrite. I mean, 3 or 4 years ago, you could send in an application that was halfway filled out and probably still get coverage at a pretty reasonable rate. And nowadays, that's not happening. You're going to have to, you're going to be explaining your systems and your controls to the underwriter in a very detailed way in order to get coverage. And then finally, I mentioned this a minute ago, but the ransomware co-insurance clauses, restricting more coverage, tightening down on the coverage grants that were broad. We're seeing all of that happening in the marketplace. So you might get coverage, but you'll have less coverage than you had before through more restricted exclusions. So I mentioned a minute ago that the market's been very, very volatile. This is what we call a hard market in the cyber world. In general terms, hard market means that we're seeing restricted capacity, we're seeing less capacity offered, we're seeing crazy rates, right? We're seeing much higher rates. And as you can see here, I mean, if you look at this table is only from November 20th to November 20th to November 21. And if you see those numbers, that's an average increase of 123% on the premium rate. And you see a lot of that has just been in the since Mayish, right? So these are basically year-over-year numbers by month. And so it has been it's just been brutal on our insureds, right? On our clients. And just say we are risk advisors. We're brokers. We're not insurance company. We're here to represent you guys. And as one of the largest brokers in the world, we access more markets than most. I mean, I have clients where we've gone out to 60 different, markets trying to get cyber coverage for folks. Public entity is a particularly difficult class of business for the insurers. So we have also struggled. You guys are kind of getting a double whammy in that it's just generally a very hard market, very difficult cyber market, and you are viewed as a very risky class of business by the insurers. And so it can be very difficult to place coverage for public entities. When thinking through this, many of our experts talk about the fact that the 123% increase is one thing on average, but the other component of this is it really almost boils more down to what can you actually accomplish in the marketplace from a rate per million perspective. So just as an example, even though the year-over-year rate looks really brutal, it's even more brutal when you boil it down to million. What's it cost per million of coverage? And that's where you see these two, total price per mil and primary price per mil. The year-over-year rate's one thing, but the price per mil cost has just gone crazy. And so, 2, 3, 4 years ago, you might have bought $1 million of coverage for $10,000, $12,000. And now that same $1 million of coverage is really more like 35 to 45 million. I mean, sorry, $35,000 to $45,000 per price a mil in that lower layer. So it's really tough. This sounds like a really bad news message, doesn't it? It is. It's a tough market. So
I was just thinking that, and I was wondering if maybe I could interject with a quick question.
Sure.
Because a lot of what we're working and dealing with are the smaller local governments. I mean, are you seeing an emergence of local governments being able to pool resources to get like a broader coverage together? Is that even an option?
Yeah, one of the challenges you have is in that situation is that the controls are also separate and the systems are also separate, right? And so to pool together resources amongst small municipalities, for instance, might be very difficult because you've probably got a pretty disparate sort of risk profile across the board, right? And so that becomes hard. I mean, we have done programs with where we've got a bunch of different agencies right? State agencies, for instance, but they have a more centralized control, right? So they get their cyber support through a state entity that provides them a lot of security. And we did have, I mean, some of my conversation today with you guys is stemming out of that work, where we ended up having a bifurcated system because you had some that did and some that didn't, and we ended up having to put in individual policies for those local entities that weren't combined. And so sort of a similar situation here with the municipalities and counties and whatnot. Be very difficult to combine them because of that disparate sort of cyber management. Now, conceptually, if you guys were to put together some group that then you could buy into and provided oversight of the cybersecurity, for instance, then that might be a way to combine it. But I'm guessing that's a few-year process, and not, that doesn't happen tomorrow.
Sure, that makes sense. And I didn't mean to interrupt the flow. I just
no, good. I'm glad you did.
Little heavy news here.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. It's a very tough market right now. So if you can go to the next slide. So we talked about this a little bit already. Not to beat a dead horse here, but the cyber the ransomware attacks are really driving the losses, and they're really driving the bus here. One thing is that the demands are going way up. The average downtimes are going way down. Going way up as well. And if you see, $800,000 average ransomware paid in 2020, that's not small change, right? That's a pretty big chunk. 40 million is the highest ransom paid to date. Obviously, I don't know that 40 million would make sense for any of you guys. That's obviously a big industrial player, but they are systematically substantially higher than they have been in the past.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, are you seeing averages on the local government side of ransomware costs?
I don't know that we have it broken out that way. I don't know that we have that data available. Privacy regulations are intensifying, and now there's this, now you've got the supply chain risk growing as well, right? So if you think about that first slide where you've got business interruption associated with things, and third-party liabilities, where your system goes down, now you're having higher risk associated with third-party liabilities as well if you've got supply chain issues that come into there. So it's a bad. There's a lot of bad actors out there, and there's a lot of losses. Next slide. So again, these are more for you guys to take away and really look at. But this is just some averaging on what some of the ransomwares have been, and we've got them actually broken down by some of the actual events there for you, so you can take a look. One of the conversations that we are beginning to really have with folks, again, we're insurance brokers and risk advisors. We're not the insurance company. Not here to say or tell you that insurance is the be all end all of everything, right? And so one of the conversations that we're really starting to have with folks is, okay, if the rates are getting this bad and you're going to have to go spend significant amounts of money to meet these underwriting triggers, right? Are you better off buying insurance, or are you better off investing in hardening your systems, right? And then maybe you reevaluate insurance a few years later, because the amount of money involved is getting so high that for some folks that just makes sense, right? I mean, it also gives you a little more control over how you step out the expense. And if you are spending it on hardening your system, you're getting additional value out of those dollars that stay with you, rather than giving it to an insurance company. In the event you don't have a loss, then you've spent money that you could have spent hardening the system. So there are, folks are really having those conversations. I mean, I haven't had one of those since yesterday. Folks are really starting to think through, okay, does it make sense to spend this much money, take this high of a retention, have this coverage, or are we better just spending the money, investing the money in ourselves? And that's not an answer we can provide you, because that's in part a business decision. Our job is to go and try and find you the best insurance coverage at the best rate we can. And then you guys have then you guys have the hard work of deciding, do I want to take this, or do I want to do something else with the money? Let's see, what else did we have? We'll go to the next slide.
I think it just goes into
It goes into the appendices.
Yeah. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and get us into some questions. As I think there was a Q&A. So one of the questions was, so for small businesses, annual policy for $1 million coverage, a reasonable price might be $35,000 per year. Is that a reasonable understanding? Obviously there's multiple factors, but is that kind of a generally good ballpark?
Yeah, that's probably a pretty reasonable ballpark. I mean, depending on certain drives, you might be able to push that down a little bit, but you're not going to get it down to the $10,000 or $12,000 it was 3 years ago, for sure. So yeah, that's probably not a bad number as a rule of thumb.
Yeah. Okay. And so, I mean, from that last point that you made, and I know this was something that we had talked about a little bit previously in just our conversations, are you seeing a shift over for smaller, especially public entities, into, I think I need to just use this money to invest in hardening my system versus going after those policies?
Yeah, typically after the underwriting process, and once you get the premiums and the coverage, all laid out, then that's when that decision starts getting discussed. I mean, one thing I'll say is that from a perspective of due diligence, if you will, going through the underwriting process is not necessarily a bad thing, right? It gives you a third-party set of eyes on what your system is and what your risks are. And so from that perspective, there can be value just in the process of going through the underwriting steps.
I was wondering that a little bit too, because I mean, we do look at whether it's NIST framework or CIS controls. I mean, a lot of the things that are covered, that are required for this coverage are those kind of basic protections that are needed. And so it does sound like that could be a valuable exercise no matter what.
Yes. Yeah. I think there's value in that. And you don't know what you don't know, right? So sometimes having a third party go through it helps you focus on what needs to be improved, right? And I'll say in the appendices for those who get a copy of it, there is information in there about sort of, also there's some very broad-based information about, okay, here's MFA, here's sort of some vendors that might do that. Because we have, as a service to some of our clients, we also have a group that helps folks through the process of hardening their systems, right? We've got true technical cyber experts beyond just the insurance piece. So, this is not a plug. It's more just that's in the appendices if you want to reach out to somebody.
And in general, though, how much does that cost? So, and do you get anything of that back if you decide to not go through with getting a policy?
No, it's completely separate from the insurance. So it's more of a true consulting thing, and it's going to depend on what it is you're looking for and how much help you need, et cetera. So yeah. Okay. But totally independent of the insurance piece.
Okay. All right. So we had another great question. So is ransomware insurance separated from cyber insurance, or is it a rider handled separately? Just wanting to make sure I was understanding that correctly.
Yeah, no, it's built into the basic form. So it's within the policy form itself. It's not an endorsement or and added. It's core to the coverage. But as I said, I think one of the things that we're seeing is folks are restructuring the ransomware coverage when they actually issue the policy or the proposal, right? And largely through AIG in particular is almost 100% of their policies that are coming out now have a 50% co-insurance clause on the ransomware. Mm-hmm. And that's done via endorsement, right? Or however you want to say it. But the ransomware itself is the ransomware coverage trigger is fundamental to the policy form. It's in everybody's policy form.
Okay. There's another question. If I have $1 million in coverage, does the source of the cost from an incident matter? For example, most of the cost comes from recovery versus most of the cost comes from paying a ransom versus most of the cost comes from legal fines.
No, the policy is agnostic to that. So no, I mean, other than if you've got restrictions on like co-insurance clauses on ransomware, for instance, and then that would obviously impact you. And part of that whole forensics piece is piecing that together if you've got a ransomware. But the policy is the policy is not, if you've got $1 million of coverage, it's not $1 million for each one of those coverages. It's an aggregate $1 million. So whether it's spent on data recovery or forensics or ransomware, the $1 million is $1 million.
Okay. And how is the cyber insurance industry starting to align with the guidance particularly from federal government agencies of don't pay ransom? That's
a really good question. And one of the things the underwriters want to know, particularly from public entities, is do you have a policy around ransomware, and what is your stance? Right. So do you pay it? Do you not pay it? And it's a little easier, I think, on the private industry side of things because it's command and control, right? Mm-hmm. And I think you guys have a little more sensitivity around how you address that issue, right? And so I don't know that we have seen a position where the carriers say you have to say you're not going to pay it. But I think they want to know that you've got a decision process in place sort of in advance. Okay. It's sort of like incident response, right? They want to know you've got incident response. They want to know you've got a thought process to go through when it comes to ransomware.
Gotcha. Okay.
And, the other thing about these policies, I will say is, and the insureds do find value in the component of the bolstering of the incident response and having the carrier in tow with you, right? So these policies the carriers are all very good at jumping right on a loss, right? So if you have the policies all have 1-800 numbers, the claims always happen. The joke is the claims always happen at 6 p.m. on a Friday, right? But the carriers are all set up to provide breach counsel. And so, and incident response support. And so people do find value in that. So when you get into these ransomware situations, for example, the carrier is typically right there hand in hand with you in those conversations. They want to know in advance. And they should be. It could be their money, right? And so there is actually value there. There's also like the breach counsel itself is very helpful in these situations because they understand the regulatory implications of the data loss, right? So if there's a data breach, they know, you go through an evaluation of where did the breach occur? Is it broader than just your state? Is it other states? Is there other jurisdictions? And each of those jurisdictions have subtleties about what's required, right? And so they're very good at understanding the federal oversight and then any jurisdictional issues you have about data breaches and can coach you through what has to be filed, who has to be noticed, what time frame it has to be noticed in, et cetera. So, and I've heard from general counsels in public entity that actually is a big plus for them.
No, that's great. And it's a nice little plug real quick before we get to the two other questions that I'm seeing in the chat. But The next month, we're actually going to have some experts from different aspects of an incident response team talking through and unpacking a little bit of, okay, so you had an incident. Who do you call?
Now, what do you do?
Who do you talk to? How do you engage your legal? How do you engage your cyber insurance? How do you engage your communications? So kind of trying to unpack that a little bit. So for those of you who are here, make sure to tell your friends and bring popcorn for that for that Marsh event. But in the meantime,
after you quit running in circles, here's who you call, right?
Yes,
after you panic, after the panic settles down.
Let's all take a deep breath and get this handled. So we have a question too. Are you seeing the carriers using the security scorecard to not write coverage?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so they will based on the application or the cyber edge thing or whatever it is they use. We absolutely have carriers who will not, who will say, no, we're declining you. Thank you. Unfortunately, we even have carriers. There's a big percentage of the carriers who will say this is a brutal message. They'll say this is public entity. We're not writing it. Mm-hmm. And then we've got carriers who will say we have certain classes of business, and for public entity this applies, right? They'll write public entities, but they won't write a lottery commission, right? Or they'll write this group, but they won't write that group. Now, I haven't seen that so much on the counties and municipalities, and we have carriers that won't write those. But so if you get a carrier that will write a municipality, a county, public entity, then you're probably not. Those on the call may not be in the class of risk that then gets that second swath of, no, we won't write this particular group within it or whatever. So,
gotcha. Okay, that's another wrench in this whole thing.
It is,
yes. So again, now two new questions here. How often are insurance companies able to recover their expenditures? For example, i.e., the bad actor is caught. I assume the insurance company pursues their money back, or is that rare?
I think it's pretty rare. So many of these bad actors are actually not, subject to the laws and civil, oversight of the U.S. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a pretty rare event that they're actually able to recover things. Well, plus it's so much of it's done in Bitcoin or in whatever currency they use, but so a lot of that stuff disappears, right? It's hard to trace.
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, I think that's part of the challenge with this too, is the threat actors are so increasingly complicated and integrated with potentially being hired as state agencies just to go and cause trouble, or I mean, it's just it's not even pure greed at this point. There's a lot of that overlap between nation states and these mercenaries. So another question here. I'm a small public library and I have a cyber add-on to my liability through a special district pool. How not likely is that? How not adequate is that likely to be?
Yeah, that's a hard one to say without looking at the policy form. There are, particularly not necessarily on the liability side, but there's some of the carriers have cyber add-ons to their D&O policies or their financial products policies. And those policies are, they're reasonable cover. They're probably not quite as broad as the true cyber policy. So it depends on the policy form and your needs and whether or not that makes sense. Now, I will say, I'll say this as another point of a suggestion for the audience, is that you also may have coverage through select of your vendors, right? So depending on who you're using and who you have as cyber support on the outside of things may provide you some additional coverage or coverage through that agreement. So it's important to look at those as well and understand where you may or may not have coverage or liability transfer to some of your third-party providers for cybersecurity.
Yeah, and that was one of the questions that I was wondering about too, is if you don't directly oversee a lot of those controls that are being required for that policy coverage, and you're putting a lot of that out to a third party vendor, what their coverage is. And so that's a question that you can ask your third party vendor, correct?
Correct. Yeah. And it's really twofold, right? It's what is the contractual transfer between the two of you? How much of the liability are they accepting through the contract? And then do they have adequate either finances or insurance to cover them and you in the event of a loss?
Yeah. Okay. That's great. We had another question here. When responding to an incident, how does the cyber insurance company interact with local, state, federal law enforcement, especially when ransomware is involved? Does it matter who the incident response team is comprised of? And do insurance companies have their own teams?
They do. They do have their own teams. And that's when I alluded to earlier, the breach counsel and incident response. They have their own experts, and they have, usually the breach counsel is actually a third party law firm that's kind of already baked into the policy. Okay. and provides counsel to the carrier and to you in the event of a loss. So yes, they do have it, and they are very involved in advising you and coaching you through dealing with the regulatory agencies and law enforcement. I don't know that they typically will stand between you and those. You're involved in those conversations, and they're at your elbow as an advisor on the law enforcement side, rather than they don't step in between you and them without your any representation without your involvement. So
it's still on you as the local government representative in that situation to reach out to, or whoever your incident command is, or whoever, to reach out to your local, state, or federal enforcement support.
Yeah, but you do start with breach counsel and with incident response, and then they can advise you on, and they can help you prepare the notices and those kind of things. Okay. But they will coach you through who needs to be brought in and when. Okay.
So kind of just as a general, more or less last question, unless we end up seeing any additional ones, but so say somebody's on this call and they're trying to decide if this does seem like something that's right for them. What's your best recommendation of how to go about starting that conversation within your organization?
Oh, sure. Ourselves, or whoever your insurance broker is kind of the starting point. Certainly, I think my contact information is at the end of this. You can reach out. I can put you in touch with folks who are more local. We've got operations everywhere. My contact information is in there. Feel free to reach out, and we'll put you in contact with some local folks, and or whoever your broker is. I mean, I'm sure most everybody here will have a broker, and then depending on their size and expertise, you can chat with them as well.
Do you have, and I mean, as part of that, do you have any recommendations for how to bring up the topic to, say, an elected official, say a county commissioner or a mayor, to say, hey, I think this is something we need to look at. Do you have any recommendations around that?
Yeah, I think I would probably start with the losses that have occurred and the heightened risk that we all face in this space. It would shock me if the elected official hasn't seen at least a few news blurbs. We both on the public entity side and on public education and on industry, we get a lot of queries coming through our contacts in risk management or whatnot, through the boards asking, CFO is asking, they saw the thing on Colonial Pipeline, and hey, what happens to us if that happens, et cetera. So most of the time they're pretty aware of things going on. But that's really, I think, the starting point for that conversation, is to talk about the heightened losses. I would say that I would also say, and it's not a great way to sell insurance, but I'd say part of that conversation really needs to be an evaluation of your own systems. And again, that fundamental question about, do we harden or do we buy insurance, right? Maybe it's a combination of both. The insurance, this is a very broad product. It is a very good insurance program. It's just gotten really expensive, right? So the conversation, I think, also needs to be had with the public officials. Like, this is a heightened risk area. There are things we can do to reduce our risk, and there's insurance available to further transfer that risk should it occur. Because I think where folks are at the tipping point is getting that attention and getting that budget and getting the funds to do the hardening. And what the insurance company is telling us now, basically what the insurance industry is telling us, is they're making that hardening process more and more important, right? Because it's harder and harder to transfer the risk to somebody else. So I think it's another good thing about the process, is it helps you convince your elected officials that, hey, we really probably need to invest in some hardening here. And here's, maybe we can't even get insurance until we do that. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I do think that, to kind of close this out, I think that's going to be one of the interesting aspects where you see in a lot of the history of regulatory standards around keeping things safer have emerged, partly because insurance companies come in and say, I'm not going to cover this faulty product, I'm not going to cover that. And so we start to have stronger products across the board.
Sure.
Ultimately, maybe one of the benefits, even though right now is kind of a rough time for it, one of the benefits of all of this unsettledness in the cyber insurance market is maybe we're going to find that we just get a lot more of our jurisdictions, our small businesses being able to strengthen their own systems and understanding what those standards really are. Because I think sometimes that's been a little difficult in this very evolving and newer field. So,
and it's been changing, and I hope that some of the information I've included here, that's one of the things that we get a lot of feedback on. Wow, that's really helpful for us to understand where the sensitivities are from the carrier. And those sensitivities are driven out of their experience. At the end of the day, insurance is the law of large numbers. And so they experience a lot more than you ever will. So let's use that knowledge that we gain from their experience to help you.
Fantastic. Well, again, I can't thank you enough. That actually was the most fun conversation around insurance that I've ever had, even though it was a little doom and gloom.
I think you're just being kind.
Now the time flew by, and I'm getting lots of good comments that this was super helpful. So really, Tom, thank you so very much. For everybody who was able to attend, we are going to send his slides out as a reference, so you'll have those as well. And of course, anytime you all have any questions, please reach out to us via that colorado-crc.com. We are here. Any questions, we'll work to get you connected with the right folks. And again, Tom, thank you so very much. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thanks for the opportunity. And any questions, we're happy to field, and good luck in the insurance market. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks for everyone attending this morning. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.